You're listening to the Talking Headways podcast network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Adie Tomer of Brookings to discuss a paper he and his team wrote about the idea of regional block grants. He discusses the local subsidies going to state DOTs and how more local funding could mean more regional collaboration on infrastructure. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super wonderful, terrific, amazing Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of city wizards and transportation experts, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. We've also got some bonus material up there, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, the heavyweight net bike scarf is back in stock. I'm also going to make a concerted effort to make some new designs, but if you want to get one of the Buster Bike scarves or the Lightweight Bike scarf now, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. And if you'd like to support the show in other ways, you can buy books at the bookshop site, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire, or find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarcholesterol. For anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook, visit theoverheadwire.com and definitely sign up for the almost 20-year-old daily newsletter. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that too. You can also find us on Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's Transit Nerds. Some great stuff coming up, so keep on listening and enjoy the show. A quick note for Patreon supporters. I've set up an ad-free podcast RSS feed at Patreon. This means if you want to listen to the show without ads or promotional episodes in your podcatcher of choice, you can do so by heading over to your Patreon account and getting the feed there. I'll post instructions in the show notes of how to do it. And if you aren't a Patreon supporter, you can do so by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Even just $1 a month gets you our podcast free of outside ads. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Adie Tomer, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast again.
Thanks for having me, Jeff. Always good to see you, man.
Yeah, good to see you too. For folks that may not have heard you in episodes 373 and 250, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. You didn't catch those episodes? You don't remember?
I did.
Yeah, you did. So, hey, everyone. My name's Adie Tomer. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. I work on infrastructure and worked on transportation and land use, and starting to get close to 20 years on this now. Still finding it all fresh and interesting stuff to look at. Like, what's cool about Brookings is everything we do, whether we're talking about what's happening in the Middle East to macroeconomics in the US, everything else, it's always free and available to the public on the web. So don't hesitate to go check that stuff out. And we always appreciate, Jeff, you always do so many links to so much work that we do. So hopefully folks are used to seeing our name around.
Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking that we're actually kind of a parallel. I mean, I've been doing the newsletter at least since 2006 and the podcast since 2013 or so. So how do you feel about where the state of planning and transportation infrastructure, all that stuff is since you started like 20 years ago?
Oh my gosh, I love that question. We've known each other. I've known you since the reconnecting days, man. So traveling in these same circles. So I'd love to see what you think about the same question. For me, and I like to think of this as hopefully what's a hopeful reminder for folks, is to give almost like specific example. If you were trying to get bike lanes across in most cities in America, good luck. Folks would be like, what are you talking about? Bus rapid transit? If you use the acronym BRT, they had no idea what you were talking about. And so at a almost like place level, I think we're in a much better spot than we were 20 years ago. I mean, find me not just planner, but like someone who's touching land use, right? It might be a transportation planner. It might be like a real estate developer. Particularly if they're under a certain age. I'm not going to tag a number, but everyone's going to imagine something in their head. That if you bring up these ideas that I think all of us who are Overhead Wire subscribers, readers, right, like kind of share, they're with us, dude. Like that is the future, not just of America. You know, I know we're still building them, but it's a real minority of folks who are like, you know, really what we need here is a much wider highway, you know, like that's not de rigueur in America. And you and I, Jeff, I mean, we're pretty similar age too. I mean, when we were growing up, that was still the thing. That was 100% the thing. You were sprawling, you're building the roads to them. It wasn't with any kind of like, no one's trying to hurt anyone, but we just, you know, America thought that was what the future was. And honestly, I think in our careers, we've seen the pivot. And now we're at that hard part where it's, okay, everyone's gotten proverbial religion on this. How do you deliver? How do you actually, you know, okay, everyone wants bike lanes. How do you actually build them at scale? How many cities do you track all the time that have ambitious plans and they knock out 5-10% of what they wanted. They're behind schedule, like what their stated schedules were and things. It's tough going out there, but I'd much prefer this world than where we were at the beginning of my career.
I think the big thing for me is, and I probably didn't see it early on because I wasn't paying as much attention, but some of the smaller cities and towns that are doing a lot of this stuff too, like the Bentonville, Arkansas and the other, I mean, obviously the Walmart's there and the headquarters and everything, and they have a lot of money to do that, but there's just like a lot of little places that are like doing this stuff that you wouldn't have thought, bike lanes, walkability plans, those types of things. I mean, they're not getting into the big transit stuff. They're not going to build light rail or anything like that or a subway, but they've started talking about all these things. And like the new urbanist stuff has like permeated. There's no talk about whether you're going to do like, mixed use or urban development in multiple stories in a downtown setting. Now it's like zoning reform. And it's interesting to see how the conversations change. I mean, when I first started, I was making like guidebooks to like different technologies, right? What is bus rapid transit? What is light rail? What is a streetcar? What are the differences between heavy rail and light rail and all that stuff? And there was a lot of extension of and planning for first routes, like in places like Seattle and Minnesota and those types of things. And now this is like kind of the negative side almost, is that like we've built out some of the first lines in a lot of places and now some of the second lines have come in, but it's taking a long time to get to them. And I always talked about this in the newsletter as well, is like the lowest common denominator syndrome, where we spent a lot of money on heavy rail in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then that got expensive. So people were like, oh, let's do light rail. Let's go and do this line to San Isidro in San Diego for the first 1981. And then, okay, everybody's going to do light rail. And then light rail got too expensive. And so everybody's trying to do streetcars and BRT. And so where are we at now with that? After the 20 years, it's still like everything's super expensive. The only places that are really doing stuff are huge capital projects like a San Jose subway or like Second Avenue extension or stuff like that. So we're talking about these massive projects, but some of these smaller projects, commuter rail lines in smaller places like Nashville or whatever, they're not getting as much kind of attention. And maybe that's because they've shifted to BRT or other bus improvements that are actually probably more beneficial than spending on some of those commuter rail lines and stuff. But I see that shift too. I don't know where you are on that.
Oh, 100%. I think, look, if I could never see another fixed rail transit line on a highway median in America, I feel like we'd all be in a better place.
I know.
I often think about O'Hare and the Blue Line, because if you go into Chicago and you're a transit supporter like many of us are, you see these stops. You're not even getting off. I mean, the doors open, you can literally smell the cars moving, right? Which is what it is. And those things just didn't work. Like we know so much more now about station design, about land use around it. I do think there's this expense element. It's obviously a whole separate line of work. Folks are touching. Yeah. My old boss is now my new boss again. Rob Puentes is back, and did awesome stuff on transit costs. Obviously, the Marin guys are doing it, and that stuff's really important. And look, I think we probably can figure out how to get the cost down, and we owe a lot of credit right now to the Abundance guys and that whole crew that's going around it. Of like, hey, let's zero in on this. Zach Litzkow's work is amazing. For folks who don't read it on this stuff, and so we got to get the cost down. But I also think you bring up this really important point that it's not like guerrilla, but it's like these more bespoke, smaller elements that can really unlock at the neighborhood scale what's set up for more proximity. I really believe actually at the beginning of our careers, we thought basically if you build it, they will come, and the transit is the if we build it part. And I think we've got that exactly opposite or backwards, if you will. What we need to do is build more neighborhoods that are high proximity. Some folks are probably imagining their head like that's like 4/1 neighborhoods like you see in Denver's and Salt Lakes and things. Might be a bunch of townhomes, but if you can have higher proximity between destinations, people then demand multimodal options that specifically aren't private driving because parking's hard and there's not a big time advantage, and that creates the demand that sustains it. So that's the biggest thing actually I'm hopeful for. And we do some work on that too. And I know that we're not alone in this. How do we think about ways to better deliver transit, biking, and other associated infrastructures in the neighborhoods that like are best suited to build up demand, build up public support, do that best kind of advertising you get. You know what I mean? Like when we go over to, they're all fortunate to see other markets, including like in the US, like New York and Chicago and Philly, you proselytize back when you're like, whoa, we can design differently, right? So I've also, I think, started to see that change too. I think folks better understand, let's invest where it's going to make sense to have demand, and that'll kind of help more flowers bloom.
I do want to ask you a question that's kind of a non sequitur to a certain extent. And I should have asked you this at the beginning, but I was going through your LinkedIn and I noticed a curious entry at the very bottom, working at a Blockbuster Video as a manager.
Oh, yes.
So I want to ask you what working at a Blockbuster has meant in your life as somebody who's focused on infrastructure, and also maybe what your favorite movie is.
My favorite movie is Dazed and Confused,
Oh,
without.
nice. I love
Yeah,
that
dude,
movie.
Linklater.
Filmed in Austin, where I went to school.
Yeah, right, totally. And to ruin the cred I just created, I'm not a Slacker fan actually, like Rick Linklater. So like I'm, I guess, anti-Austin in some ways, but he's just an awesome filmmaker. And I think for those who haven't seen it before, especially the younger crew who can more relate to being in high school on a personal level, it is quite possibly the best high school movie ever. Yeah. Anyway, so that's my favorite movie.
Did you, by the way, before you get to those things,
Yeah.
did you read Megan Kimball's book?
No. What is it?
So you should. It's City Limits, and it's about the expansion of highways in Texas. And she talks about how Richard.
Yes. I'm supposed to read this. Yes. No, but
Yes.
Sorry.
And so she talks about Richard. He actually helped set up, I think it was Richard Linklater, who's helped set up a preschool, but it's right under the I-35 where the expansion is going to happen. And so when they do the expansion, it's going to get taken out and they have to move. And I think they might have figured out where to go by now, but he was the one that kind of helped set that up. And it was like, he owned this building. They needed a place that they were moving from Congress Avenue. And so anyways, there's a connection to infrastructure right there, just from Dazed and Confused, right?
Yeah, totally. Totally. Yeah, so I'll be honest, I didn't learn anything, I think, about cities and regions working at Blockbuster. But what I did notice, and again, I might just be aging myself here, is Blockbuster was, I kind of normally hate this term, but like it was kind of like a third place, you know? And I managed it I went to school, University of Florida in Gainesville, pretty typical, like big public school, college town. And there were just always groups of people coming in, right? And I think we all remember of a certain vintage, age here of like doing that with buddies, friends, family, going in and grabbing a movie together and the communal experience that could have. And I'm sure community has been replaced in certain ways, but we all know the stats here on this too. We're not congregating like we did before. So that was one of the coolest parts of working at Blockbuster was I was the like pusher, if you will, right? For friends, including giving away the free product, that I wasn't supposed to be. Sorry, Blockbuster people, although I don't think they're gonna get mad at me.
There's only one left, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, what it really was, honestly, Jeff, it was just a cool job.
Yeah, for sure. But that is connection, though. I mean, thinking about community and people deciding not to go out or staying in, and how the pandemic has kind of pushed that even further, right? So I don't know if you saw, there was an article recently from Eater where they were talking about third places and defining like, what is a third place? I had this in the newsletter like maybe a couple weeks ago, basically like saying, what is a third place? Is it places that you just congregate? And also if people want to go out and they don't want to be bothered, does that actually count as a third place? If they're just like going somewhere to go somewhere, but they don't want the interaction that comes with it. It's just really fascinating to think about that and like how that experience at a Blockbuster. And I went to the one in Kingwood where I grew up, many times with my friends on a Friday night looking for a movie that we all wanted to see. And where we probably picked up Dazed and Confused, and we probably picked up Monty Python and the Search for Holy Grail or whatever else. And so I find that interesting as well. And I think there is a connection there.
Yeah, totally. And look, this is some of the coolest stuff happening with data right now is folks grabbing on, the volume got turned down on this now that we're out of a pandemic. But you and I both know, and a lot of folks probably listen, especially folks who like that research section at the bottom, like this is not ended. The ability to see where people are moving on a pretty granular level and trying to figure out where we're congregating, like we are only scratching the surface on trying to understand this stuff. So we do a little bit of that, but kind of at the end of the production process. So just for anyone hearing this who wants to do more on that, especially on the more academic side, the data producers, please don't stop. I don't think we're even close to figuring out how to better understand what we're doing now and then how the built environment can kind of respond to tap into it. Because we need to come together more. It's such an important part of life. This is neither of our professional lanes, but I think we can all safely say it. Like, being together is a lot healthier
than being on our own. Yeah. Okay, so I really wanted to chat with you about an idea that you had at Brookings that you shared recently, which is the idea of this regional block grant. And I'm wondering what this idea is generally, and then we maybe can get into more specifics.
Yeah, so let me take a mini step back on how we landed on this.
Sure.
So we were doing two different projects at Brookings that kind of organically took us here. One was an assessment of states' departments of transportation. And we looked into their accountability, both in terms of how transparent they were with, frankly, their planning, their project selections, how they spend their money. And what we landed on there was, even with, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt, the best of intentions, not a very accountable kind of form of governance. And what we kind of figured out through that work was that it is really hard to know. It's published, but let's be honest here, right? Like it's really hard to understand why a state picks the projects it picks, what kinds of networks it builds, and any kind of fiscal or basically like monetary relationship between the states and its municipalities. And by the way, when I say municipalities, I'm counting like cities, counties, even like metropolitan planning organizations or MPOs. councils of governments, right? In California, they're real dogs. And that obtuse nature was a real problem. And what we also figured out with it is that states are not sending their transportation dollars down to their locals. And maybe we'll pick that back up, but let me just leave it there. So this was a big eureka moment for us that at least in the transport world, in the surface transport world, we are not set up for success there. The other project that we were doing with some colleagues down in San Diego, the Policy and Innovation Center, was a question that arose kind of uniquely out of all those competitive grants that were in the infrastructure law, with the IIJA, or quote unquote bipartisan infrastructure law. And just so folks know, the super short version is 25% of the bill all of a sudden became competitive, hundreds of new programs, tons of work for the federal bureaucrats, tons of folks at the municipal and even some at the state level to try to apply for these. The question we were curious about asking is, well, can regions better get access to all this money? If the vast majority of federal funds, especially in transportation and water, which is the bulk of public money, it's going right to the states, and then it gets distributed down from there. Again, this is the connection. On the transport side, not so much. On the water side, they have to give it to the utilities, but even there, it's kind of obtuse process too. What we wanted to ask was, okay, well, for those of us who care about cities and regions, like metropolitan regions, there's some big projects we got to execute. Did the IIJA actually make it easier for metropolitan areas to land awards for their big regional serving projects? And what we figured out was that the data was next to impossible to kind of flex in this way, meaning on the pure data side, to actually understand, first of all, can we even see how many awards are going to a regional actor? Now, later, to give huge dap here, Corrigan over at Transportation for America solved this. So actually, folks can kind of go look at some of the analysis they're doing. But at the time, it wasn't so easy. And then critically, what we couldn't see at all was who's even applying for this? Are regions really getting it? So we set out to do a lot of interviews. We had hopes to mine the data. We really couldn't, just being upfront about that. And then when we started talking to folks across the country, federal bureaucrats, folks who worked at Chamber of Commerce, of course, metropolitan planning organizations, municipalities, all the sectors here of infrastructure, even energy and broadband, what quickly came to the surface was this is a nightmare, actually, in America. And some of it is systemic. I love democracy. There's no butt coming and say, and I love the U.S. kind of system to vote with our feet, as for those, Tebow would say, if you will, to be all academic-y about it. But we got a big problem in a lot of regions, metropolitan regions, where the level of separate different units of government from an infrastructure and land use perspective is off the charts. Collaboration is really, really hard. Now, the metropolitan planning organizations help with a lot of that. The councils of governments help with a lot of that. But we realized quickly the federal government has a huge opportunity to incentivize this kind of regionalism, as like an old Myron Orfield would call it, metropolitics. We've done a lot because of the forced structures of MPOs and COGS, because of the federal money. That's incentivized everyone to get around a table. What we quickly realized, though, is that the money is not there, though, to force follow through. And it's a huge gap in our system. And we think it's a big explanation for why we're not delivering enough regional projects.
So the money goes to states mostly?
Money goes to states almost exclusively. And then states don't share a lot, man.
No, they don't.
They've got their own stuff going on. You're living in a state that's pretty good about it, actually. And in all kinds of ways, economic development programs that the state of California runs. And I don't think it's because it's a proverbial blue state. There's other, Utah has incredible relationships with those municipalities at the state level. This is not a political divide thing. But most states, no, they're not sharing a lot of money unless they have to.
Well, California, sometimes they're required to send it straight to the MPO, right? So there's that.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. And it really is what's on the books in the states. There's huge variation across the country. On average, just for pure transportation dollars by our account, per federal highway dollars, 16% of funding gets to locals, but that includes both federal money and state money. The federal dollars, there's actually no requirement for pass-through at all. And most states actually really kind of don't. What they end up doing is sending down their state gas tax dollars. If you broaden that to all, beyond just surface transportation, all transportation projects, we think at Brookings it's even lower, 14, 13%. The median's even lower than that. So it's pretty rough out there. There's a reason we should really be concerned about this, not to segue us too much, but around who's paying gas taxes. Because what we also just figured out through some work, and again, this is called highway shakedown. So if folks want to look it up, this is where I'm pushing something. It's not like plugging it. It's like, I really think this will open people's minds to a whole different way of thinking about fiscal relationships. Over 30%, way over 30%, 34% of VMT is on locally owned roads. VMT is a basic proxy for gas tax dollars. You're going to go plus or minus depending on how many freight vehicles there are, going on state-owned U.S. highways and other state-owned roads, a higher state share. So it would be like a lower for locals. You can go the other way though, right? For more locally oriented places where just less VMT is happening on state roads. Remember, the fuel inefficiency on local roads means actually you're consuming more gas on them, right? So, but let's call it like 34% of tax dollars on gas taxes are coming from local roads. When you're only giving them 16% money back, localities are grossly subsidizing states. And again, I'm being upfront about this. Every time I talk about it, I just get angry. But the eye-opener part of this is like, oh, well, this is why we're struggling in America to build the stuff that communities of all sizes need. Local governments who have less fiscal capacity than states are subsidizing the state DOT. If we can't figure this out, it's going to be impossible to where we started today, right? Like to build all the bike lanes and the BRT, but frankly, and this is the bigger expense, to fill the potholes. Local roads are in bad condition in America compared to the gold-plated state-owned roads. And so this is the eye-opener here, right? It's like, how do we think about ways to get the money back to the locals and to deliver not just these local things, but also these like regional serving projects that can define places for generations to come?
So then where does the money go if it goes to the states and then they don't give it back down? Is it just go to repaving projects around the state and the expansions and things like that? Does it go to this thing that Beth Osborne and I talked about a while ago, which is the state capacity, that they have all these folks to do all these EIRs and EISs and get stuff through the process, where we're complaining about high-speed rail in California, for example, and trying to get the folks that know how to do this stuff? Like, where's the money going? Is it going to that capacity? Is it going to the repaving? If it doesn't go to the cities, where, by the way, a lot of the local funding that we talk about in the past comes from property taxes and other things, when people are like, oh, the gas tax covers everything. Where's it going?
The short is it's going to the state-owned network. If it's not going to locals, the states are spending it themselves. And we've got to be asking in every, not just state, but then the communities, what kinds of projects are the states building in these backyards? And through this work, and you've probably seen this before, the federal government announced in the early 1990s, the interstate highway system is built. Like, this is published federal government data. It doesn't mean we can't expand. It doesn't mean we shouldn't, by the way. That's like my own two cents. Like, if we need a new like turn lane near the Port of LA, heck yeah, build that. That's getting goods to everyone across the country, right? Like, there's places we need to expand. But for the bulk of it, the actual point of the interstates from a trade perspective, the connections between cities and metro areas that are, not adjacent to each other, that is built. So now, and I think this gets back to stuff that Beth talks about too. Well, what kinds of projects are they building? For whom? What are they trying to achieve with it? And look, there's a lot of maintenance needs, but there's also a lot of capacity expansions. My bigger point when I'm trying to raise this is the state should be able to kind of do what it wants with its own money. It should be thinking about how it has, from a fiduciary responsibility set, take care of these interstates and U.S. highways that, by the way, we all rely on. Even if you don't personally take them, right, the goods that come to your door do. So we as a country are stronger economically by having that network. But when they're overly subsidized, they are making decisions on investments that is like not an accurate picture of what their means are, right? They're able to live beyond it. Meanwhile, our local governments, they have to take those property tax dollars that could go to, by the way, schools, public safety, hospitals, and they've got to put some of that into roads because they're actually losing gas tax money that their residents, their business owners are paying in through using those local roads and subsidizing when the states are built. So the states, we kind of know generally what they're building, but if they're building it out at a significantly larger dollar figure, right, than they can raise on their own, then we've got some big stuff we need to address.
It just makes me think of, and go back to Megan's book, just thinking about all of the major highway expansions that are happening in places like Austin and Houston and Dallas, redoing the I-345 connector, those types of things. All of those things could be the money that actually comes from cities, and it could be used for cities, but it's really used to go through cities, right, rather than to them. And so I think about that when you're chatting about these discrepancies and disparities. The other thing is, again, going back to that staff capacity, like how much the state DOTs have in staff capacity to do all this stuff and to lord over the local agencies. And then also at the federal level, you talk about this in the report too, the federal capacity and what they have the ability to do, whether they have the ability to help locals figure out, how to apply for a grant or how to, build a bike lane or build a subway or build a high-speed rail or whatever it may be. But this capacity, not the road capacity, but the staff capacity is another interesting angle on this that I was thinking about when I was reading through what you wrote.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I appreciate you talking about it before too. That's spot on. I didn't even pick up on of course, the staffing, that's the last of state DOT's fiscal issues. Meanwhile, we hear this all the time, right? Including folks you talk to at a local level. Hey, we've got this great stuff we want to do. We're short on people. We don't have enough people to execute those projects. Well, I mean, when you're taking away billions from localities across the country, think about how much staffing they could do, right? If they had that money back in their pocket. Absolutely. And, we're all planners on some level here. And we believe in the power of the proverbial, measure twice, cut once style, let's make sure we put our time into these plans we want to put together, what we want to build in places. And absolutely, it's a shortfall. And you brought it up. It absolutely disadvantages the localities in terms of permitting, project delivery, when the states have these huge capacity advantages due to this fiscal advantage.
So then your solution is to create a new type of block grant that basically is almost like the direct pay stuff that's happening in the IRA, right? Like you can directly go to the federal government and be like, I want some of this energy infrastructure money. So is it along those lines made after the community development block grant, or how is it structured and what does it look like?
Yeah. So the short is, in our minds, this is a lot like a CDBG, at least to start with, in surface transportation. And I'll get to that in a second. But in an ideal world, you've got a whole different kind of broad set of block granting that crosses all these infrastructure sectors. And frankly, to streamline and trying to merge the two leading DC political parties' ambitions here, right? I think there is a split the difference kind of compromise. So how can we get fiscal efficiency in terms of who it's delivered to, streamline the ability to deliver projects, but then also return to a little bit more of local discretion on what we're building in America. So starting with surface transportation, why I raised this issue about the money on the gas taxes, actually, there's a whole pot of money at the federal level. We estimate it to be around $10 billion a year that's coming from local roads that is not delivered back to them in terms of a guaranteed sense. And frankly, probably almost none of that money is going back to them. So let's think about actually delivering it back to them through this block grant. You deliver it to the metropolitan planning organizations, which again are effectively required by federal law. There's no place that doesn't have them to make sure they can get other money that already exists on the planning side, which is peanuts, right, compared to the capital money we're talking about. So you got these MPOs, 300 plus. They already have a fiscal relationship with the federal government. So you send the money to the MPO, whatever the cut's going to be. You then leave it up to the MPO within some kind of guardrails that Congress decides. They can be actually pretty streamlined on this too. How you distribute that down to counties, municipalities. Here's what's really nice. You know who makes up the board of MPOs and COGs? Municipalities and counties, right? Let them decide at the board level where they already meet, where they already do their horse trading and things to decide, hey, here's how we're going to splice up the federal money. And then what you can do through that, because projects, we all know this, projects always exist in a place, meaning, there's one municipality who's getting a project that's regional serving often, but so you got to think about how do we share these fiscal resources to move those projects? My confidence from talking to so many of these folks is that if you actually put money on the table, we're talking big money. We have not published this table. I'd rather not, but I'm sitting on it. So just to put in people's minds, we're talking over $300 million a year in Los Angeles. That's a lot of cash, even in LA. You can do a lot with that. Again, just to be clear, that's not a one-time, we want a competitive grant, an infra grant that's big, 300 million. No, I'm talking about 300 million plus every year as far out as we can see, as long as we've got highway trust fund dollars coming out, which is, that's a whole separate conversation. Yeah, right. But we do for quite a while, and we'll probably continue to invest in it. So that's a lot of loot. That's loot you can also bond off of too, right? I mean, frankly, speaking of LA, that's how through Measure M&R, right? They're building out such incredible transit there, right? So all of a sudden you've got this new pot of money. How do you start thinking about, Jeff, you brought it up, high-speed rail. Hey, actually, you know what? Maybe this gives us the opportunity to actually spend some more of our own local money because we really want to get this going. Maybe I always forget the past name, right? But to get the high-speed rail part going north, actually towards the rest of the state, we want to put money in there because actually it's going to help us for some local connections too. All of that will now be on the table if we can deliver this money back to regions. So, the way you ask the state questions, like where are they putting it? It's like, oh, like where their heart's content, right? The answer on the local level for how we see this working with pretty easy mechanics is the new money, now metros can spend it to their heart's content. And we can really start to tap into all these creative ideas we hear about all the time at local levels in every place.
Are you worried about MPO structure from that perspective? I'm thinking of the MPOs that maybe have a lot of suburban elected officials on them who are focused outside the city. I mean, the city of Houston, had a vote to get out of their MPO and it never came to pass, but they wanted out because they weren't getting the attention that maybe they thought they deserved just from the money that they were getting in the MPO. So I know that, Jerry Brown basically restructured San Diego's MPO because it had too many outside folks who didn't represent as much population as like the city of San Diego. So are you worried about that structure as it exists now, where it is kind of oversubscribed with the suburban politicians and elected officials versus maybe ones that represent more of a population base?
Yeah, it's a great question. I have an answer, but I just want to preface before I start answering. I have no interest in being like a politician. So, but I'm going to give you like, no, dude, it makes sense. I'm going to give you the political, like politician style answer first, because I think this is important for everyone to keep in mind. What I care most about is that money's getting to locals. Communities will be in a better place if they have more money in their capital budgets. Period. Like full stop. Folks know it. What's the stuff the state want to build? Let's say on state-owned corridors in regions, which is a whole separate thing that we're starting to look at, versus the right of way that locals own. Locals want to do the best stuff, right? They want to build bike lanes and think about bus prioritization lanes and all that good stuff. So getting money into their capital budgets, that's going to solve a lot of problems in terms of incremental improvement. Now, you're spot on. MPO governance is an issue. I don't play for any team. I'm just saying that's the consistent issue you hear about through both the research and the applied experience, like you've just brought up in Houston, is that big cities are typically underrepresented on their MPO boards. We're going to have to address that. And frankly, there's an opportunity for Congress to write the rules in such a way, and we see this all the time. And frankly, like CDBG does this, where we're going to say we need to require X amount of money, right, goes to municipalities, cities, counties of certain sizes. They've got to receive this much share-wise. And then it's up to them what they want to do with it, right? Meaning they could pool it with their neighbors to build something big, but at least they have fiscal authority over that. All of this can be addressed, and it's going to require some real work to think about that. But again, back to where I started, and I'm as much saying this for potentially Hill staff who are listening, we can't forget the forest here for these trees. Locals aren't getting enough money. They can't build the projects they want. And I think we kind of just figured out a big reason why. This was one of the coolest parts about our research. We did a ton of interviews across the country, and consistently this theme kept popping up where the MPOs, the COGs, they're a great table to come and talk, to build networks, to build trust, honestly. But they often fail to work together on capital projects because there isn't extra money on the table yet. There certainly isn't a pool of regional funds. So where I'm trying to go with this is I think we see a lot of the MPO board tension because it becomes, especially if you're like in that Houston example, hey, I'm outvoted. What am I even doing here? Right? I think if we throw a big bag of money in the middle of the proverbial table, if not literal table, then I think folks are actually going to collaborate a lot more. Because now all of a sudden there's fiscal tools that say, we saw all this great work like the National League of Cities have done and the other partners on the local infrastructure hub, right? Where like, hey, if you put competitive grants on the table, people will go for them. If they don't win the grants, holding your coalition together is hard. You win the grant, the coalition will continue, right? So we think of the regional block grant program, whether it's transportation or bigger, this is a way to actually incentivize full follow through on regionalism, folks working together on a day-to-day basis on big ideas at the metro scale.
Now, to be clear, this is also, I mean, there's even more money on the table than you're talking about because you're talking about just transportation policy, but there's also the water policy. There's also the broadband policy. There's also all the money that was coming for electricity and green infrastructure that came for the IRA, that some of that's going to get cut by the Republicans, but it's going to be there in people's minds. And, we'll see next 6 to 8 years how that gets changed. But that's a lot of money that comes to the table. And now you're starting to talk about working together from a transportation standpoint, from a broadband, from water, from all these regional issues. And then you have a lot more money on that MPO table or, structured in a way that can bring people together that might not have talked to each other otherwise. And there might be some co-benefits there from those extra monies as well.
Oh, 100%. Our buddy Yona is always talking about it too with his European work. America has to wake up to the fact that the size of our local economies are just completely busted beyond these municipal borders. And yet, for a bunch of reasons, oftentimes schools, but for others, we're not going to melt those municipal lines completely away. And again, by the way, personally putting my values on the table, I agree with it. I think there's like some democratic advantages to having this like stratified style system. Is there a right size? I don't know, but like centralizing everything, Nashville, Indianapolis, Louisville style, it doesn't just solve all your problems at the local level. So it can work for some places, other places no. But infrastructure is a different story, right? Infrastructure is built on economies of scale. And we define our regions, in the nerdy way by commuting patterns, but it's not just that. It's like, this is where we all spend time together. It's what we consider our like proverbial neighbors. The dude you can go hang out with that night, at like the third space or whatever, their place, and you don't have to get on a freaking plane or something. These are our homes. And so finding ways to put all that infrastructure money on the table together in a common pot with particularly the MPOs and COGs with the voice of the municipalities there, it just feels right for our economic, basically like evolutionary place. New York City cannot do this stuff alone anymore. We know this. We know congestion pricing. That's the whole debate. It's a real debate about regionalism, right? In a lot of ways, and fiscal authorities. This stuff plays out on every single sector of infrastructure and built environment we're talking about. And yeah, again, I'm a broken record, but I'm like, if we can just put real regional money on the table, I think it's a worthy experiment in America's evolutionary place to see what happens.
It's interesting, the last couple of weeks, we've had some 3-alarm fires related to transit funding. We have, Illinois, Pennsylvania, California, large blue states that are having these problems. There's also obviously states that are facing fiscal cliffs all over the country. But J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, after not getting a deal through, he said, the state can't just be the only one responsible for fixing this, right? And so I think what you're talking about is actually a way to fix some of these issues that we're depending on the states to come through, because locally we can't seem to figure out how to get that transportation infrastructure and the way people move to coalesce. We had Madeline Brosen on. Actually, we talked to her on Monday, and the show will come on before this show. But we were talking about mobility as a service / universal basic mobility pilots in Los Angeles, and the way that they gave people money to be able to use anything but a car, right? And the way people move, if you give it to just a transit agency, people move in different ways. They use a bike, they walk, they take transit. Maybe they might need a ride hail every once in a while. Maybe they might need to fix their bike. Maybe they might need other types of funding. And that kind of opens up this idea that the transportation policy needs to be interconnected and intermodal more than maybe we give it credit for. And so this isn't just a state deal. It is a regional deal. And there needs to be the boundary disappearance from a certain perspective of infrastructure, because that's just the way people move. And that's the way the economics and getting together in third places like you're talking about works.
Yeah. Look, I know the history of all the handshake stuff, as much as it's been reported in the colloquial tales on why transit gets 20% of federal gas tax dollars and why there's a mass transit highway count. Look, folks can debate whether we should be spending that money. I think we could actually argue the good thing about the mass transit count is that's the only guarantee that this money gets back to regions. And they're still subsidizing. If we give another 10% of the tax dollars directly to regions, we would still be below what they're putting into the system. So the federal government absolutely should be in this game. And what we're seeing, because the locals are being starved and the states are being fattened, if you will, no wonder we're going to the Pritzkers and the Shapiros to say, hey, you're sitting on the bigger sum, like not in a premeditated way, right? It's like what the actual balance sheet tell you to do.
We're telling them to flex it, right? We're like, flex the funding. You're allowed to flex the funding, but...
Right. And honestly, those governors and any governor who steps up for this, there's a lot of them, honestly, in different ways. And again, it's not so politically divided like we see in the rhetoric. And, people want transit to run. They get it at a local level. I really do believe that. But we don't have enough of the fiscal resources going to the regions to make these calls. So they need to go hat in hand to the state. And when I say it's wrong, I'm saying it's wrong because it's fiscally deeply unfair. We talk all the time in the US about this concept of the user pay principle. Not only is it broken, but if you do really believe in it, here's the evidence it's truly broken, and here's the offshoots of it. We kept using this example when we were doing all this work of like, you can see when you get off a state highway, especially in like, let's say the snow belt, you see when you get off the highway because all of a sudden the road is in bad condition. And these are still principal arterials, right? This is not like a low use road. These are major roads you're moving onto that need to be smooth too. And it's just visual evidence of where we're starving ourselves. We've got to right size this. And then on top of it, we have these awesome regionalism arguments to do it too. To have more strategic thinking for places like a Chicago and Philly and Pittsburgh that have these kind of older, quote unquote, legacy transit systems that are still so important to how their communities operate. They can make choices to invest in those. the Nashvilles and Austins, right, that are trying to now retrofit as they feel the geometric pressure of trying to just do it by sprawl, which just doesn't work. They could use more resources to retrofit in different ways. They could build different relationships with the states too on what they need. So it's like always, when you manipulate dollars in this way, you get you get the desserts of your manipulation. And we've got to think about how to roll that back. And I think we'd have much better conversations, much better investments in all these places if we did it.
Now, how likely is it that you can get a bunch of Congress critters with like jagged districts who, might not believe in regionalism to understand why this is important to them and their constituents?
I think we've got two problems in Congress in terms of communication to help folks understand how much we're all in this together. But the House is really important here, meaning versus the Senate. So number one, the vast majority of members, it's basically all of them, they represent a metro area, if not multiple of them, if the metro areas are smaller. Or not even, for example, like Chairman Graves of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, he gets the bulk of his population both from a mix of Metro Kansas City and Metro St. Louis, which, by the way, tells you how unique his district is.
I mean, where I lived in Austin, I love telling the story. Where I lived in Austin, I was on the edge of 3 congressional districts, and one went to San Antonio, one went to the border of Mexico, and the other one went somewhere over to Houston. And so, they go everywhere. They're very wacky the way that we've gerrymandered the country.
Totally. And again, I think for folks who focus, of course, on electoral politics and power, there's a whole different thing to analyze on those.
Yeah.
But for us, it actually matters on built environment and infrastructure related conversations, because who do you represent? I'm actually defending the members. That's really tricky, right? You defend different places, but here's what's common. Their source of constituency, almost all of them, is a metro area, and invariably a big metro area. So this is the thing to remember. Flip through our passports. It's just pictures of open place, like plains. I think Mount Rushmore is in there. Yeah, that is a beautiful part of America. That is not what America is. America is cities and suburban strip malls, and that's where we are. And that's what we're representing in the House, actually, too. Here's the second part. And we actually just ran these numbers as part of this block grant paper that we put out. Over 90% of large metro areas are split apart by congressional boundaries. 226 metro areas have more than one congressional district. So for them, it's really hard to get everyone on the same page to advocate for what they need. In other words, it's really hard for the House to do that. But at the local level, they are one place, at the MPO board, at the COG board. So what we're hopeful for is that Congress will understand that, number one, especially on the House side, hey, you know what? I'm not getting enough resources actually to my district. I'm sending resources to my state. I can see a senator pushing back on that, but a House member, they don't really represent their state. They represent their district. And so we're putting something on the table to get more money back to their district. The other part of this too is thinking about how will they get a chance for more ribbon cuttings, more ways to execute projects. So again, there's just the getting dollars local, but then there's this whole political element to it that you're actually going to be able to open more projects to be able to say you supported those regions and create this virtuous cycle of what's going on there. Now, whether the House members hear that and see that, that's a hard conversation. It really is. I think it's okay for us to talk about the quiet stuff out loud, understanding these debates where the states right now are getting subsidized. They are going to fight tooth and nail. I would if I worked for a state or if I worked for their membership organizations, right? They should. They should be fighting tooth and nail to hold on to it. What we've got to do is help folks understand on the Hill. And that's why everyone has a role in it. Again, I want to repeat it. Talking about, we think $10 billion a year. This is huge money. How do you convince folks, hey, we're not starving the system. We're shifting. It's like shifting the stacks of chips. And still the majority of it sits with the states because now that we built out this highway network, they have the majority of VMT, right? But this weird legacy of everyone pays for the state network because we didn't have one, in the 1950s. We need to get off that and try a new model. We have to have actually a structural shift. And I think the House members could be made game to it, but where the constituencies really matter, business interests especially need to be talking to them. Chambers of commerce are actually struggling through this. They are not getting the investments locally that would help all their members, whereas the monies are going to places further afield inside their state. They need to really be asking that. And of course, coalitions of public sector, civic leaders, right? They need to be pound the pavement with their House members, telling them what's going on.
From a land use perspective, and just listening to you talk, I was just thinking about sprawl. And maybe it's because of the discussions I've had with folks recently talking about supply chains, talking about the Robinson-Patman Act, the things that are happening that cause sprawl. And obviously you're not going to sell some of those folks in Congress about stopping sprawl. That's not
the
going to move any needles, right?
No.
But I am thinking about the Houstons of the world, and we've had folks come on and talk about this too. And this is one of the findings that I think is my top finding of the year is, California is not built out per se, but it's hit its edges. And so now we're having a housing crisis because it's harder to build in central cities than it has been before. And we're going to see Houston and Dallas and other cities, and they're starting to kind of feel that a little bit. They're going to come upon that same thing. And there was even a Glazer paper about this recently too. I'm just thinking about that and what that means if you get that pot of money in a regional sense from a transportation perspective. What does that mean for like the housing and the shortage that we're seeing? Because if we run out of space and all of the money before from infrastructure funding was going to that sprawl, and the way that we could build lots of housing was those tracts of land that were huge, and we could build thousands of units of single family homes, it all comes back kind of, the backwash. The backwash comes. And so how do we deal with that?
Yeah, I love that. Two things to tackle. First, let's start with like the Congress, the sprawl thing. I'm really passionate about this. Of course, we're not lobbyists, but like you talk to folks in DC, that's the job, right? And it's really important to not try to bring your individualized vision of what, not like utopia is, but like your perfect community. That's not what Congress is for. That's what's so cool about America. We can have all different kinds of places. And actually, you can let the market decide what's competitive wise, if you will, winning, right? Like, what do people want? And so when we put out these ideas, look, I'm on the record in places, I feel like I grew up in sprawl. I don't love it. I do love people having affordable housing, and I do like people achieving their visions. I wish personally, like now that I'm on the mini soapbox here, I just wish we priced it effectively because it's got a lot of negative externalities that we're not capturing in the US. And
yeah, the extra subsidies and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And some of that can be solved local and state. Like we don't even need Congress to do it. But the point is like, I don't think Congress needs to like have a sprawl pro or negative agenda, if you will. What I want to focus on here is fairness. And that simply sending it back to states does not, nor has it ever meant that all of the communities in that state are going to be uplifted to their own kind of ambitions. And so we've got to really remind Congress of that. And that's really important. So different state DOTs do different things, right? That's not the point. The point is let's actually get money back to where it's fair, allow communities to engender themselves to this. The second point you're bringing up, though, which again, the abundance crew, if you will, but especially the two authors of the book deserve a ton of credit. It's like really raising the profile of these issues because like a lot of us were working on these topics before. So we're just well prepped. And that's why I'm actually so appreciative. They make our lives easier. We can talk about our topics more. It's really cool. I think what they're really hitting up against is what you raised, which is what happens when regions, particularly in an automobile-oriented technological age, which is basically, outside the northeastern parts of the Midwest, even places like LA and San Francisco, they retrofitted themselves for it almost. Like we built that model. We now know, physically speaking, how hard it is to build in certain places. And we need a totally different construction regime, especially on real estate, but also, of course, the infrastructure that connects it to address these crises of people not being able to live in the places they want to live. Houston's going through it its own way. The irony of Connor Doherty's recent piece, which I thought was great. Connor's a super free thinker,
He grew up like a block from me, for where I am right now.
No shit, man. Yeah, dude. I love talking to Connor. His piece.
He got a lot of anger from that one.
Oh, of course he did, man. Because he said the stuff that people didn't want to hear. Look, I've been in like affordable housing meetings in DC where I'm like, yeah, we do have an affordable housing program in America. It's called sprawl. No one wants to hear it, but that's what it was. And then you get in these bigger places. And the irony of what he just put out came later, right? I don't think it was in the piece. But that specific suburb was like, hey, by the way, we're actually trying to shut down development now. Like we're totally bull. And ironically, of course, it's the infrastructure that's really holding them back. And that includes like public works, like schools and things. So the only model here for sprawl is keep going, right? Like geographically, keep going. And eventually you will run out of land at a local level in the sense of the constant, the time that people want to spend traveling. So we've got to figure out how to go up everywhere. And we don't have the right agenda for that yet. But more money locally is going to make life easier to start thinking about different kinds of programs, different kinds of incentives. Other stuff we're working on at Brookings, what we're thinking about is what are those kinds of fiscal instruments on the transport side that really could be not necessarily like cutting edge, but aren't used that much, or maybe not even exactly invented yet, where the financing model, if you will, on transport was we'll build the highway so you can develop that land. Well, that's broken now. But also the answer isn't necessarily like subway tunneling everywhere either. We don't have those densities. You brought this up earlier. We might want more bus rapid transit, more kind of bespoke, smaller price tag kind of investments. I actually don't think we're fully thinking yet about what the financing model can be through the transportation budgets. So if we build those up at a regional scale, We see this here in Cleveland, Ohio, where I actually live. Shaker Heights, Ohio, it's a streetcar suburb, so there's my bona fides. But the Port of Cleveland here is a super interesting model. They actually use their revenues, and of course they have bonding authority, to then make loans for all kinds of real estate developments across the region. And many of them are kind of like urbanist stamp of approval, if you will. I don't know if that's their agenda. I just want to be clear. Like, they really help projects, particularly in the inner core, because it's the Port of Cleveland, right, to develop. Are there more models like that we can think about how to use big stacks of public capital, right, which often live in the infrastructure departments, to then help let loose the kinds of development in the right places and make deals that might look like they can't move, actually like address those gaps, what folks term the financing gaps, right? There's a lot more to mine on financing, corridor-based, TOD-based properties. I know some colleagues that want to do some work on this that's coming. There's a lot of work to do here, but we just need to get more public capital at the local level so they can really start to stretch their arms and legs and test some new stuff out.
Are there good examples like internationally for this, like in Asia or in Europe or other places where we can start to like look at what's happening when you do give all this money locally?
I don't know. It's one of my favorite things to say, I don't know. We don't know, right? We need to look into it. I mean, we all know like the trans example on like Hong Kong and using the air rights and the station development, right? But like, that's not what we're getting at here, I think. It's too small. What we know in the US, we use TIFs, tax increment finance. Like, there's tools we've got, but clearly it's not addressing the full deal that you're bringing up of actually densifying the amount of density a community wants, right? Like Houston doesn't want necessarily what San Francisco wants, but they all do want to densify effectively at different levels. I don't think we know yet what the full toolbox could look like to deliver on it.
I'm just thinking from like talking with Eric Eidlin, who was at FDA at one point. Now he works for the city of San Jose on their station planning for the high-speed rail line for Diridon Station. And also what Yona's talking about, like thinking about from a structural standpoint and from a staff capacity standpoint, like what does Germany do, or what does France do, or what does Japan do? I was telling you I went to China last year. Like, what does Shenzhen do, or what does Hong Kong do? Like, how do they build those 10 lines in like 10 years? Like, how does the Ile-de-France, how do they build the Grand Paris Express and the structures and high-speed rail? Like, what are the structures that the station developers come from the state level? Those types of like capacity things. And so I kind of hinted at this earlier with my capacity question as well. The state DOTs have all this capacity now to go through the process, the EIR, the development, the design of systems. And then, for transit or for bike lanes, for everything else, you hire a consultant and you bring them in. There's not a lot of like local capacity to do those things. And so I'm thinking of like examples from other countries of capacity that we can bring back, the abundance or whatever it might be, that we can bring back as examples. And a lot of folks don't like to listen to things from other countries. There's that problem too, right? There's like, well, we're America, we're different. And we have this problem even in the US. They're Portland, they're different. They're San Francisco, they're different, whatever it is. And so I'm just kind of spitballing here, but that is interesting to me.
Oh, I think it totally is. I think, look, Jeff, you're putting out really good research ideas for folks, and folks should take the idea and run with it. I mean, that's what's so cool about research is it's a really open, collaborative community where folks you're fellow moral, philosophical travelers with, like, you're all in this together. There's a lot we can do. My last quick thought on it is what always works in America is showing a balance sheet where we're going to do well. Our currency, in terms of language, if you will, is profit in America. And that's just built into the system. We're a market-based democratic economy. And we're going to need to think about going in those directions to build more of this stuff. We had a model that worked for highway construction beautifully. Privatized profit, built this huge public works asset, right, that now we own. 1991, the feds were like, yep, we did it. I really still think we're stuck in limbo on what's the new agenda. And that's not going to just come in one piece. Frankly, the interstate build out. Jeff Davis over at Eno has done amazing work. It took decades of conversation, testing different stuff to get to that point. And I don't think we're going to have a one size fits all actually answer here, but we need a different agenda for building public works in communities and making sure we can privately build, or maybe even publicly, right? If you want to copy like the Viennese model somewhere, like publicly, privately building the real estate developments that's going to allow those neighborhoods to flourish in a different way than they do now.
There's a great article in Nonprofit Quarterly about a webinar they held with Shelterforce where somebody was talking about that same stuff. Is like, thinking about the profit model, we can do it differently where we look at housing as infrastructure instead of just housing as, something that people, our landlords, profit from. Because, we've seen what happens in Virginia and other places where they started thinking differently about it. And that's probably, something that we need to think about too, is like, if we're going to be in a market-based economy, like how do we just think differently about how we're providing these goods to the market or providing infrastructure that people need? need, which includes housing. So I could talk to you forever. I feel like we could go for hours and hours on this. You mentioned at the top of the show, but where can folks find this paper and more of your work?
Thanks, Jeff. And yeah, dude, I could also talk to you forever. we do most of the time not on the mic.
Right.
So brookings.edu, or just like search infrastructure Brookings, or even my name on the web, or SEO folks in the comm office are really good. You can find Brookings out there, but I really mean this, and hopefully you can validate, if you will. Like, folks should drop me a line if they want to talk. That's how we learn. Most of the folks you see working in policy shops in DC, we don't get smart by talking. We get smart by listening. So curious to hear people's thoughts on these ideas and what we missed and how we can do it better.
Awesome. And where can folks find you if you wish to be found on social media?
Oh, dude, LinkedIn is it, man. It's not safe anywhere else. Yeah, and that's a great place to drop a note too, to get in touch with me personally too. You can find it through the Brookings forum, but yeah, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm trying to put everything on LinkedIn these days, so please, if you're interested in the stuff I'm interested in, please reach out. I'd love to connect.
I mean, that's where I found out about your Blockbuster adventures, right? So there you go.
I know.
Well, Adie, thanks so much for joining us again. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Talk to you guys soon.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters who support this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. You can support the show as always by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Sign up for our almost 20-year-old newsletter as well by visiting theoverheadwire.com, or check out the show notes for merch or other opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.